Everybody, today is Tuesday, January 28th, and our new guest is John Helmer, who's an author and geopolitical analyst. Welcome to this podcast, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima.
And let's get started with what has happened in the aftermath of the Donald Trump's presidency before 2024 presidential election, he was talking about that he's going to put an end to the conflict in 24 hours. Since then, he has changed his rhetoric toward the conflict in Ukraine. Right now, they're talking about 100 days to manage the situation with Ukraine. But when you look at the way that Donald Trump is talking about the conflict, exaggerating the number of casualties on the part of Russians and underestimating the casualties on the part of Ukrainians. And recently he was talking about at Davos, he said that he's trying to put pressure on MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, in order to reduce the oil price and putting pressure on Russia. How do you see the attitude of Donald Trump? Is he going to solve the problem in Ukraine, or he's already in line with the rhetoric of blob of the deep state in the United States?
Well, Nima, as you introduced me, I'm basically, since 1989, focused and based in Russia. So what I have to say comes from the perspective of Russia. And so I'd answer this way. Donald Trump's probably the best enemy Russia at war with the United States has ever had. He's imperialist in ideology, he's pathological in mentality, and he's very predictable. That includes the nonsense, the misspeaking, the falsification of facts, all the things that you've just mentioned make him more predictable in the war that the US has been running since 1945, but especially since 2014, since the US installed the regime in Kiev, the war against Russia on the Ukrainian battlefield. Understanding Trump as an enemy, as a predictable enemy, means, from Russian point of view, taking account of every conceivable kind of threat that he throws, whether it's economic sanctions, whether it's opening a northern front like in Greenland, which isn't new. Trump's claims to take Greenland have an American history going back to the 19th century, as many listeners will know. And his attacks on his threats against Russia to squeeze Russia and impose even tougher sanctions, that's not new either. On the other hand, Russian reaction, and I'll try to answer your question as if it was directed at the different factions and the different groups that make decisions in Russia in fighting this war. In the first place, as a predictable enemy, you have to take account of what Dmitry Medvedev has said. I'm just looking up, and I need to put my glasses on to read it, but it's very important to understand that Dmitry Medvedev not only was former president of Russia and as a member of the Security Council, was a potential candidate to succeed President Putin later this decade. Now, what he said on December the 27th, so as post-Christmas announcement, was that the United States should be ignored. Here, everything is simple. I'm quoting him. We have no friendship in the next 100 years. And to fight with America is ordained. A direct conflict will clearly develop into a world nuclear war. That's what he's saying is likely because of the way the United States' leadership behaves. He doesn't deny the line, the official line, that Russia remains ready for negotiations and discussions without preconditions. This is what President Putin has said, and I'll come back to what President Putin has said in a minute. Although, in my opinion, Medvedev says, in the current realities, these talks are in principle impossible. And to be quite frank, it's not clear whether it's necessary at all. In other words, that's a highly skeptical view about the point of negotiating with any American leadership, any US government leadership, on the part of a senior spokesman and a senior participant in the Russian decision-making process. Now, the President Putin is not the only decision maker, and many people who are your guests keep making, and I have to emphasize and agree with them, that Russia has a collective leadership represented by the president, and that collective leadership has democratic disagreements over how to deal with how to fight this war. And President Putin recently made a brief but carefully staged press interview, only a few minutes, in which he, for the first time, appeared to endorse Trump's notion of the stolen election of 2020. And Putin went on to say that perhaps if Trump had been elected, there might have never been a special military operation of February 2022. In other words, he's endorsing some of the statements that Trump has made, and he's doing it for television purposes. Why? My sources, my colleagues, my Russian associates, and I have to follow everybody all the time, that's my job, believe that Putin was trying to address Trump personally in the only way that it is understood Trump is capable of understanding. He understands a television image flashed at him as he believes that he flashes his television image at everybody else. So it's a form of compliment, an invitation to talk. On the other hand, there's fairly serious division of opinion between the military, the general staff, on the one hand, whose operations have been restricted by the president in the run-up to the inauguration and in the run-up to the so-called negotiations. Now, negotiations have been going on for quite a while. It's very clear that President Putin has designated Vladimir Medinsky to have back-channel negotiations. There are many other back-channel negotiations between businessmen, between television figures on both sides, all representing or claiming to represent, as Viktor Orban, the Hungarian, claimed to represent, intermediaries in an attempt to end the war. But there's very clear distrust of the United States' commitments, undertakings, threats, offers, and proposals. There's a long history of that. And I would say President Putin is a balancer, always a balancer. That's thinking and speaking politically, which also means saying contradictory things, which mean different things to different groups, both inside Russia and outside Russia. So if we begin our discussion with the notion that Russians have one general view, and that is that Trump is a predictable enemy, and that the Russian response in warfighting with a predictable enemy is to put up a balance of force which will deter or defeat the enemy. And this is the vital existential requirement for Russia's security going forward. And I've just quoted you Medvedev saying that going forward, there'll be war with the United States for another 100 years. That's a serious long term, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm so happy that you brought up this point because if you remember, all of us remember that before the conflict in Ukraine started, it was all about Putin, that Putin is trying to, I don't know, march toward the European Union. He is a imperialist. He wants to capture the eastern part of Europe, maybe marching toward the western part of Europe. Here comes the question that many of us were asking all along this conflict in Ukraine. What is the main hatred in the West toward Vladimir Putin? Because as we know, when he took power, he tried to be more connected, more close to the Western powers. He suggested to be part of NATO. He wanted a better relationship with the United States specifically. And with Germany, he tried so hard to have a very sound and realistic relationship. But at the end of the day, you see nothing but hatred toward Putin. And it's all about Putin in the views of these people in the West, neocons. What's that all about?
Again, I think it's not a new phenomenon. It's a racist phenomenon. Hatred for Vladimir Putin reflects an underlying hatred for the Russian people, for the Russian race, for the position Russia occupies in Europe. And whether it's expressed as anti communism since 1917 or anti Stalinism since, let's say, the run up to the World War II, or since 45, the effort to the so-called Cold War, which was another war to destroy the Soviet Union. In each case, there's a hatreds. I would say one of the psychopathological outcomes of an ideology that reflects underlying US Anglo-American imperial ambition in Europe. I think the answer to your question begins with the understanding that from a British point of view and then from a US point of view, there can be no toleration, let's say, no accommodation, no détente, no partnership with a powerful Russia in partnership with Germany, treating Germany as the significant European power with which Russia, as you said, and Putin in particular, wanted to have long-term beneficial relationships. A strong Russian-German partnership economically will dominate or would dominate Europe, and to that extent would end US occupation, militarily speaking, of Germany. Now, today, what do we face? We face the new nuclear rearmament. That's the placement of US nuclear weapons aimed at Russia in Germany, in Spain, in Greece again, though they were removed from Greece during the time of Prime Minister Papandreou. And they were removed from Europe during an earlier phase of the Cold War and the subsequent 1991 revolution in Russia. We have a complete form of mobilization, which is in Germany. I'm telling everybody what they already know, that the US, with collaboration from people like Chancellor Scholz, over the opposition of former Chancellor Merkel, Germany has taken a role that Hitler had taken. And so one sees German weapons with Germans in them on Russian territory fighting in this war. And we've seen Germany accept the destruction of the gas supply to Germany in the Nord Stream sabotage. So Germany has been won by the United States and that the risk of a German Russian partnership in Europe has, for the time being, been destroyed. And I would begin a discussion of race hatred uh, with the underlying interest on the part of the US in particular to maintain its empire and its control of Europe. And President Trump, in dictating that Europe must pay more for US weapons to defend itself against the hated Russian race, represented by the hated Russian leader Vladimir Putin. This is sort of comic book stuff, real hatred, but comic book expression of an underlying war against Russia to prevent a Russian allied alliance, a Russian economic structure that in Europe that would compete against the Anglo-American structure in Europe. This is the way it has looked to me certainly since 45. And the tactics have varied depending on what Russian was in charge in the Kremlin, and what role the US and the British believed they could play in manipulating whoever was in charge in the Kremlin. Does that answer your question?
Uh, the other point in the way that they're talking about, if we assume that was the main goal, as you mentioned, do you think that was they could have achieved that during this conflict in Ukraine? They could have demonized, let's put it this way, Putinize Russia and demonize Putin and Putinize Russia, if that was the main goal. And here is the question with the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think that in a long run, the way that the United States is treating Russia would benefit the United States?
I'm not sure I understood. I don't think that the US is mistaken. I mean, I once served in the Carter administration. I was on the civilian side of the White House and on the Office of Management and Budget when Zbigniew Brzezinski controlled Jimmy Carter in developing that version, that chapter of the war against Russia. And that was to be fought in Afghanistan principally, but not only in Afghanistan, initially secretly. So I don't believe there's ever been a lack of US governmental confidence in fighting Russia and exploiting what's believed to be Russia's weaknesses and vulnerabilities, corrupting Russian leadership, and so on and so forth. For example, just to take a more recent example about which I've written, there's not a tale not often told, and that was during the Obama administration when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. So between 2007 and 2009, there was a serious effort on which it appeared Hillary Clinton was agreed, and the current CIA director, William Burns, actively agreed to sell the Opel car division of General Motors, which was in bankruptcy at the time, in de facto in bankruptcy at the time, to sell Opel with German collaboration and financing to the Russian side. And that would have created a significant German-Russian car industry combined. The Russian side believed that Hillary Clinton, through her family, had been significantly bribed, taken money, millions of dollars, through the family to agree. In addition to the Clinton family consent to such a deal, there was very strong reason in Washington for an agreement on a German-Russian car deal, financed partly by the Russian state banks and partly by the German ones, with the active support of the German car workers and unions and Chancellor Merkel. At the very last minute, Clinton said no and stopped the deal. That was, if I'm not mistaken, the very last time a very significant difference of opinion in Washington over how to accommodate the Russian side in Europe came close to, let's call it, a cooperative settlement. And it was backed by, as I've said, corrupt inducements to Clinton. And it ended with the view, and President Putin expressed it at the time, you can't trust the Americans ever to honor their word, even when we've paid for it. Now, there was at the time, but others know the Obama administration better than I do, a strong belief that one could accommodate Russia. They called it reset. But the underlying outcome was more predictable. The US control of Europe would prevail over any attempt on the part of well-meant or well-meaning Americans on the one hand, and well-meaning Russians on the other, and well-meaning Germans as a third party, to reach an accommodation, a peaceful accommodation in Europe. Well, we were already well on the road to war, as President Putin warned in the famous Munich speech of 2007. And rejecting the Opal deal was, one could say, in retrospect, predictable. But again, I'd say you have factions in Washington committed to the notion of regional peace and regional prosperity that benefits the US indirectly and directly, and factions in Washington who rejected that. And the war party won in Washington. And now look where we are.
I remember during those days of Obama administration, he called Russia a regional power.
Yes,
He wanted to humiliate Russia, and the same
correct.
way is happening right now. They're talking
Well,
about Russia being humiliated in Syria, in Ukraine. They couldn't, in the way that they're picturing the conflict in Ukraine, the Russia wanted to subsume all of Ukraine in 1 week, as Donald Trump pointed out recently, but they couldn't do that. They have been suffering a lot in Ukraine. They're losing in the Middle East. But who's right in what Russia is today? Is Russia the way that the United States, together with the mainstream media, are trying to picture for us, or is something different from that?
something profoundly different. I would say that we have a revolutionary moment in Russia, in which, on the one hand, we have an accelerating victory on the battlefield, which has been paid for with a serious casualty rate, nothing like Trump's numbers, but which has demonstrated the capacity to defeat any US-made or NATO-produced weapons system, either offensive or defensive, ground, air, or naval, the defeat of every one of them by the Russian military forces. And the slow, deliberately slow, restrictively slow advance along the line of contact across the 4 regions of Novorossiya, with the aim of destroying the capacity of the Ukraine as a platform for the US and NATO to attack Russia. So on the one hand, the revolutionary moment in Russia is a an unusual opportunity to secure Russia for the foreseeable future from all threat. Now, to secure Russia from all threat over a long period of time, we just heard Medvedev described as a 100-year war, requires the defeat of the Ukraine and the US and the NATO forces on that battlefield so that they cannot rearm and then come back in 5 years or 10 years and attack with greater efficiency than they were preparing to attack in 2022. At the same time, the cost to the Russian economy and the cost to the structure of the Russian domestic society is great. So we have a revolutionary moment in which the oligarch, let's call it oligarch capitalism that's prevailed in Russia since 96, since emerging out of the Yeltsin chaos of 91 to 96, and developed with some stability and popularity by President Putin since the year 2000. We have a crisis for oligarch capitalism because he can't fight this war and didn't want to fight this war. We have, as I've recently written, very serious foodstuff inflation. Potatoes at 65% price increase in the past year. Eggs 48%, beets even more. We have serious food inflation, which doesn't respond to the stated policy of the central bank and Governor Nabiullina, which has imposed a 21% key interest rate. Now, at 21% key interest rate, you have the depression of all new investment, domestic investment. And you can see that everywhere you look. On the one hand, you see prosperity in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the success of President Putin's policies of balancing between fighting a war to survive on the one hand and winning, and preserving business as usual at home, which is effective for some groups but not for others. And Russia has a very significant impoverished population, which still needs gasification and electrification and food supplies and transport and so forth and so on. So we have to face in Russia a long-term decision, a decision for the long term of how to structure the future economy so that it can support the defense expenditures required to defend the country. And before we get to the budget problem, we have to produce a military outcome which can make Russia safer so that in the future, less military expenditure is contemplated. So between oligarch capitalism at home, which also involves the continued ability of those who control each of the main sectors of the Russian economy to send their capital abroad and disinvest from Russia, between that form of economic management and policy and fighting an effective war against the US and the rest of Europe, there are obvious arguments, factions, disagreements, and they have some urgency now. And that brings us to a revolutionary moment, as serious as Russia faced in 1991. That's how I feel where we are now. On the other hand, any recent visitor to Moscow will tell you how normal it seems, how happy people seem to be, how let's say indifferent, they're not really indifferent, but how indifferent the public display appears to be to the fact that Russia's fighting to survive against, let's call it, half the world. Appearances can be deceiving. revolution this time round is not going to be celebrated triumphantly, as I remember watching and being in the so-called Yeltsin revolution. But we are at a revolutionary moment in which the end of war negotiations, and they involve Trump, and that's where you began, Nima, and the decisions of how to preserve the economy to defend the country's future and its future survival, those decisions are very serious and revolutionary in their impact.
Yeah. One of the main reasons, in my opinion, during this conflict in Ukraine, that many people are criticizing Russia for not being so quick in capturing Ukraine or fighting Ukraine or defeating Ukraine. It seems that Russia, since the conflict started, tried to rebuild its relationship with other nations, with China, India, within BRICS, with Iran, and they have totally changed their strategy toward the West. But it takes time to happen. In
Yes,
as we know, it's not like so quickly changing everything. But how about the way that many people are criticizing Putin for this continuous conflict? And they're saying that Putin could put an end to the conflict in 2 months, 3 months, but he's not doing that. Was that the main reason? One of the main issues that you've raised is the economy of Russia and the way that they're trying to manage the situation in Russia. It was that one of the main concerns on the part of Putin in order not to go in Ukraine 100%, or maybe he had some sort of fear from NATO that they're gonna join the attack, they're gonna join Ukraine, they may attack us, because there were various issues in those days that this conflict started. Russia had to think each and every issue on its part. Do you think, what was the main issue in those days in the Russian mind that they didn't go in? If you remember, they went in Ukraine. They went into Ukraine by 120,000 forces. That wasn't so big comparing to what Ukrainian had, a 700,000 soldiers prepared to fight Russia.
correct.
What was that all about, in your opinion?
It's very important to what you say, Nima. Let's say 100, between 100 and 150,000 forces on the offensive against more than 5 times that number in defensive positions on the other side. That's an expedition. It's not an invasion. I recently had to review a book that endlessly repeated the line that Russia launched a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine. It absolutely did not do that. On the contrary, exactly as you said, what was launched was a force believed at the time to be necessary in its limitations to trigger a change of regime in Kiev. And it met disastrous at the Battle of Hostomel, or the Battle of the Antonov Airport, differently described, essentially the dropping of special forces into the airfield, the Antonov plant airfield near Kiev, which was intended to begin a process of triggering regime change in the government in Kiev, followed up by the lines of ground forces that were driven in long columns, very visible, north and east of Kiev. This was an essentially a very limited military probe to trigger what was believed to would occur, a counter coup in Kiev. Well, it didn't trigger a counter coup, and the Russian forces were killed. It was the Battle of Antonov Airport, the Battle of Hostomel, was a disaster for a defeat for the Russian forces, a tactical defeat. And Russia withdrew at the same time as there was the Istanbul negotiations to find an accommodation. So you had two, in parallel, a failed military operation to change Zelensky's regime, and on the other hand, a negotiation in Istanbul, mediated in a variety of commercial, corrupt ways, to try to find an accommodation between the two countries, short of a real extended so-called full-scale war. And both of them failed. There are many versions of the failure of Istanbul, and I don't think we need to go through them, about which I've written and about which President Putin has, and many Russians have said in full as to the failure of Istanbul. One of the parts underestimated is that the texts of the agreement were not acceptable to the Russian general staff. And they made it very clear that there'd be no room for Mr. Medinsky to implement such a scheme. And that was happening on the Russian side when on the Ukrainian side, we're told that the then Prime Minister of England, Boris Johnson, and others pressed Zelensky to abandon the terms he'd offered, and because of the belief that they could win their war against Russia. Now, Russian army, the general staff, have an extraordinary history and a very recent extraordinary history of learning very quickly from their mistakes. And we're not exposing any secret when we say that those early operations of the special military operation, not a full-scale invasion, but a limited expeditionary force, failed. And they cost dearly Russian lives. And from those mistakes have come important lessons. In addition, there have been lots of military lessons to learn, particularly in the conduct of drone warfare. As many military experts have pointed out, this is a completely unprecedented new form of warfare in the air, on the ground, and at sea. And Russia has had to learn very quickly the lessons to master what the other side was throwing at it, and still throws at it. At the same time, Russia has had to mobilize its military capacities to fight an escalating war. And it now has the capacity, far greater than the US and NATO combined, to fight a long and sustained, if you like, full-scale war. So the achievements on the Russian side of overcoming its mistakes, and there have been other tactical mistakes, we don't need to go into the battlefield mistakes. There's plenty of, too much in a way, tactical description of mistake and victory that obscures the overall strategic problem that you began with. And that is, how can you fight a war on the one hand and a domestic, keep business as usual in the domestic economy on the other hand? And how do you do that when half the world is dividing against you? So that's the economic warfare, the sanctions warfare dimension. And Russia's had to do things that most countries can't do historically in a generation, and Russia's had to do it in 3 or 4 years.
And in terms of what Russia could have done in order to manage better the situation with the conflict in Ukraine, do you think that this continuous conflict, this and just keeping on and on with the conflict in Ukraine, not putting an end to the conflict quickly and rapidly, was that benefiting Russia, or it wasn't that much beneficial for Russia and Russian economy?
Uh, well, I think, Nima, you explained in your opening part of your question um, that a force of 150,000 cannot defeat on the offense a defensive force of, say, 700,000. We have now reached the point where the Ukrainians have lost very much of its army and almost all of its foreign supplied and domestic fighting equipment. The Biden administration's probably delivered before the inauguration what some Russians estimate to be 2 years of warfighting capacity, the materiel for 2 years, plus the ability to hold on in Kursk and to continue to threaten deep drone raids as far as Ryazan and other deep Russian territorial targets. So we're still at the point where the Russian advance is far short of the destruction of the enemy. We are still at the point where Russia has to face, as Medvedev has recently said, but he's hardly the only one. He's expressing popular opinion as well as general staff opinion, as well as opinion in the Security Council, that that any end of war terms cannot freeze the conflict on the present battle lines. That simply gives the advantage of the Russian tactical victory to the other side, meaning the United States, NATO, and its allies, the extra time to replenish what they've lost, what Russia has achieved expensively on the battlefield. So there's a very strong view in Russia on the part of the general staff and within the Security Council that there can be no end of war terms that involve freeze. There has to be, to go back to my earlier point, an outcome in negotiation which does more than give Russia and the other side time to prepare to fight again. Because if that's all that's achieved for short-term relief on both sides, the economic troubles Russia faces will not be relieved, will intensify, because the other side is not going to offer an end to sanctions war. So Russia has no prospect but to face the reorganization of the domestic economy in a way that wasn't contemplated by President Putin or the oligarch leaders of each of the sectors of the Russian economy, wasn't contemplated in 2022. So what we have is a very strong argument, and I expressed it in reporting what Dmitry Rogozin, the senator for Zaporozhye, who is one of the most experienced of Russian politicians and a presidential succession candidate. And he's now not only a senator, but is also active in combat and in preparing troops, his forces and his units with which he's associated, on the contact line. And I've summarized Ragozin's view of end of war terms between now and end of war as acceleration, decapitation, mobilization. Acceleration means the very strongly, widely felt view that Russia must capitalize and accelerate on its battle line of contact, battlefield gains, past Pokrovsk, past the current targets, and establish the capacity to prevent long-range drone attacks on the Russian hinterland, accelerate on the battlefield. That means more weapons, more men, more movement forward. And at the moment, that's restricted, on the one hand, by President Putin's commitment to uh, Trump and his negotiators to prevent a, let's say, to create an atmosphere in which negotiations for an end of war can take place. The second element of the Russian position that Rogozin has identified is decapitation, the end of the Zelensky regime, the end of Zelensky as the commander of the Kiev regime. Now, President Putin has expressed this many different ways, but none quite as dramatically as that, though many of his associates on the Security Council have been clear. There's no room for Zelensky to continue. He is illegitimate now. The Ukraine has no legitimate negotiating structure under its own constitution for an end of war discussion. Therefore, end of war discussion has to be, on the one hand, between Russia and the US, and on the other hand, one of the preconditions for any end of war has to be new elections in the Ukraine. And finally, mobilization is the third element. Acceleration, decapitation, and mobilization. Mobilization means a new approach to the way in which the Russian economy is structured so that it can continue to fight a war at the level NATO is throwing at it for the future, and preserve the capacity to reinvest, which you can't do at 21% key interest rate, which is Nabi Ulan's contribution to the war effort. Most Russians think 21% is not a contribution to the war effort. It's a fifth column effort to destroy Russia's capacity to go on fighting. So mobilization from Rogozin's point of view, and a very strong view in the country, is that President Putin should increase state planning and state direction. You don't just order the solution for the rise of potato prices. You don't have a limited state intervention to increase imports from Egypt, to increase supply, and dictate to the supermarkets the price at which they should sell potatoes. That's state intervention, but it's at the wrong end of a mobilization to fight a long-term war. So I don't know if I'm wandering away from your question, but as I've said, we are in a revolutionary moment in which you can't do all the things, but you must create preconditions for end of war negotiations. And you cannot accept a freeze or a short-term solution. And that's apparently what General Kellogg has been carrying in the private back-channel negotiations from Trump. While Trump thinks he can intimidate President Putin into concessions to avoid what Trump thinks is his even stronger weapons. Well, we go back to the beginning. Trump is utterly predictable, and Russia knows how to fight it. And the notion that Trump's inauguration and coming to power would be beneficial for Russia was a factional view, often expressed by pro-Russian bloggers outside of Russia. And it's let's say it was mistaken then, and it's silly to repeat it now.
And actually, the way that Donald Trump is talking about the conflict in Ukraine, he's trying to intimidate Russia into negotiations. And if you remember when the conflict started in those days, that Putin was trying to negotiate with the West, with the Biden administration, he sent his forces with 130,000 forces in Ukraine, which was little which was not considerable comparing to what Ukrainian had in those days. But he was trying to force, he was trying to show his seriousness toward the conflict in Ukraine. He wanted some sort of negotiation. We didn't work with the Biden administration. Right now, coming forward, right now, between Donald Trump and Putin, Donald Trump is trying to play a game with Putin. And he's trying to say that Russia is weak, Russia is losing, Russia is not capable of putting an end to the conflict without the United States. And on the part of Russians, they're talking about freezing the battlefield, as you mentioned, and going after some sort of negotiations, which was rejected by the Russian officials. Here comes the question: what would be the future of the key city in Ukraine, which would be Odessa, in the eyes of Russians? Because that would be a huge bargaining chip for Russia and the United States.
It's not yet a bargaining chip. I've often been asked this question, and clearly Odessa is a Russian city. Clearly also, the Kiev regime has purged it of its Russian associations, whether by removing statues or covering Catherine the Great's statue and so forth, or deculturizing the Russian traditions of Odessa. Odessa has remained loyal to Kiev, but Odessa's ultimate loyalty, most Russians think, is to its own commercial survival and prosperity. And there's a lot of traditional Russian joking about the way in which Odessans treat and mistreat Russian visitors. I think that there'll be no negotiation for Odessa. Odessa is simply going to be surrounded by a Russian control, in which the economic incentives for Odessa will be to side with the winner, to side with the money, and the money will be Russian. Meantime, the Russian military targeting in Odessa is to destroy British and other foreign missile and drone bases and guidance systems for attacking Crimea and other parts of the Black Sea. I think that I think Odessa will be an outcome, as Kharkov will be an outcome of a combination of the advance of Russia and the agreement on demilitarized zone between the Novorossiya, the four regions of Russia that have been taken from their temporary Ukrainian alliance, and the distance required to protect Russia from new Ukrainian attack. In a Ukraine which may not exist, Medvedev has said it, Patrushev, the former Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, has said it, even President Putin has said it slightly more politely. Ukraine will not exist in its present form at the end of the war. That's a requirement for Russia's long-term security. Let me add, just by way of answer, that the last steps that were made before the war became inevitable were made by the Foreign Ministry, December 17, 2021, when the Foreign Ministry tabled two pacts, non-aggression and mutual security pacts, one to the United States and one to the NATO allies, laying out the terms for a non-warfare relationship between Russia, the Ukraine, and the NATO allies. And those two pacts were dismissed in 4 weeks by the Blinken-Nuland regime. And then the march to war became inevitable. There was no possibility of avoiding a military clash. And when the military clash began, as we agreed, President Putin limited it in the hope that it could remain a limited expedition with a change of government and terms that were discussed in Istanbul. Well, we now know all of that failed. We also know that the terms of the December 2021 pact remain, let's call it, a roadmap for Russian negotiations with the United States. President Trump can't read a document. It's that long. And even if he could, he predictably thinks, as you've described it, that he has the balance of firepower against Russia, when this is preposterous, when it's wrong, when it's demonstrated every day on the battlefield that he hasn't. And when it's also demonstrated that if Trump wants to exercise his firepower and it's defeated, he will retreat. That's what he will do. That's what's going to be another part of the negotiation if we get there. And therefore, we don't really know how many steps over how much time it will take for Trump's negotiators to create, let's say, a paper prospect that the two leaders could discuss if and when they met.
Yeah. Sergei Norishkin, director of Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia, he proposed that Russian Historian Society, with the participation of other countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland, even Poland, to talk about the future of Ukraine. It seems that they're moving forward with even with the western part of Ukraine. How is that going to be if Russia takes the eastern part of Ukraine? And we know that the more than 50% of their natural resources are located in the eastern part of Ukraine. And Odessa been under the control of Russia, which is huge because the connection between the Ukrainian government and the Black Sea would be Odessa. If that's under the control of Russia, that would hugely impact the future of Ukraine. Here comes the question on the western part of Ukraine. How do you see the situation with the rest of Ukraine or the western part of Ukraine, as we know that are various ethnicities, Romanians, Hungarians in that part of Ukraine?
Well, Poland remains as hostile to Russia today as it was at the beginning. And Poland remains a very fresh platform for US war making against Russia for the future. And Poland's paying heavily for this. And I've tried to report this from time to time. The Polish installation of nuclear capable weapons in the north represent a direct nuclear threat to Russia, and Russia's warned about that, as with the similar Aegis battery in Romania, representing a similar nuclear threat to Russia, against which Russia's come up with the Oreshkin, a non-nuclear form of counterattack that's equally lethal but non-nuclear. I don't see Poland, which is coming up for a presidential election, as breaking from the Trump line or the US line anytime soon. Orban of Hungary goes in one direction and another in an attempt to improve Hungary's economic conditions. It needs Russian energy. I mean, we don't need to go into the Hungarian domestic needs, but we do need to point out that as friendly as Orban seems to be towards Russia, he's equally unreliable. He's always got his one hand pointed towards Russia to shake President Putin's hand, and on the other hand, he's got his hand out to Brussels to improve his budgetary and economic conditions in relation to the European Union. He will go both ways, and he will move in the direction of the greater benefit of himself politically and of Hungary as he calculates it. Clearly, Hungary has shown symbolically that it wants to defend the ethnic Hungarian population of Transylvania and the southwest of the Ukraine. And a collapse of the regime in Kiev and a retreat of the regime to Lvov, for example, where it would be landlocked and would be based entirely on, would be basically a mercenary army. It would be it would be like Idlib in Syria, a kind of outpost fueled by, paid by the Europeans, armed by the Americans to continue the fight against Russia, a sort of Stepan Bandera regime installed in a tiny part of Ukraine which cannot support itself. It's not a sovereign country. If that were the outcome of a combination of military and diplomatic moves over the next 6 to 12 months, then clearly Hungary would be stronger, Poland would be stronger, and even Romania would be stronger in asserting their, let's call it, interethnic interests in controlling those small regions in which their people predominate. But the Poles, for example, have no reason to trust that particular neo-Nazi faction in Lvov. They murdered Poles as readily and as enthusiastically in World War II as they murdered Russians and Jews. And that's an ongoing issue of conflict between Warsaw and Kiev. But Poland remains under US control. And there's no prospect, I think, in the outcome of the presidential election or under the present government with its composition, particularly with Sikorski as a significant figure. There's no prospect that Poland would act out of US control. And therefore, I don't see the prospect that Poland would take over let's call it the sector between Krakow and Lvov that was German Polish during the World War II, when it was the German army that dominated and and ran that part of the Ukraine from Krakow. I don't see that happening. It's talked about, as you said, Mr. Narishkin has sort of advertised the possibility of the Allies sitting down to feast on the corpse of Western Ukraine. And that's an understandable attempt to put cats among pigeons.
And do you find Orban honest in his way that he's talking about Hungarians in Ukraine? Is he really concerned about those people?
Well, a politician is dishonest by profession. Or to put it another way, politicians, good ones, have to balance constituencies and interests and beliefs and ideologies which are in conflict with each other. And a successful politician can achieve that balance while staying in power and making the constituencies comfortable with their reward at the expense of their own domestic rivals. This is normal politics. It's as normal in Russia as it's normal in Hungary or Slovakia or even the United States. So the issue isn't whether Orban is honest. The issue is whether he tells the truth about his role in mediating between President Putin and President Trump, candidate Trump, before the inauguration. I think he exaggerated his own importance, as a couple of other mediators, a former Prime Minister of Israel. Notorious exaggerator of influence are the Israelis. Mr. Orban is exaggerating his importance, and to his credit, Hungary has achieved a level of, let's say, prominence in PR terms, in European terms, from his effort to establish an independent Hungarian line. But with what practical achievement and success? Cheaper gas? No. Territorial gains? No. A Hungarian might be better than me at estimating with what practical success Orban has can demonstrate from his approaches in both directions. I think it's good PR. I don't think it's much more.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know that we can continue this talk for more than 3 hours, but we have some sort of time limitations. But we can keep these talks, and next week we're gonna manage an appointment to talk about the ongoing issues in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. Not only, yeah.
I look forward to that. Yes, we've got lots of unanswered questions, and I think we're opening up answers that you, in your position, are making possible for our audience to hear for the first time, and to enable everybody to anticipate a very different world in the next week, in the next month, in the next 6 months, in the next year, let alone the next century, but to anticipate a different world from the one that the propagandists, the much better paid than we are promising for us. So let's look forward to a different world that we can understand next week.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Nima.
See you
Thank you,
soon.
man. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.